So the next part to talk about is the nervous system overall. The nervous system is basically broken into two main parts. The central nervous system, sometimes shortened to CNS, that's composed of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which is basically everything outside of that. So all of the nerves, axons, dendrites, essentially everything stemming out from the brain and spinal cord. Now the peripheral nervous system, so again this is all the parts separate from the brain, separate from the spinal cord, is further divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So the somatic nervous system basically relays sensory and motor information to and from the central nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system controls a lot of internal organs. So think of autonomic as automatic. So it's something you're not really in control of. The autonomic is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. One way to look at this is kind of this tree diagram where you get the nervous system up here, the CNS, the PNS, and then further somatic and autonomic. So under autonomic, again, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So remember, autonomic, internal senses, smooth muscles, but it's automatic. You don't have a lot of control over it. And then sympathetic, part of the automatic or autonomic nervous system is kind of emergency related. Think of fight or flight, and parasympathetic is more just general housekeeping of your body. So again, one way to think about autonomic, specifically the sympathetic nervous system, has to do with the fight or flight response. So over here on the right, if you think about, you're walking across campus or walking in your front yard in your community and you see a giant grizzly bear. It's not your pet, it's just kind of out there rummaging through something, maybe some trash in the street, and it makes eye contact with you. Well, you're probably going to go into a fight or flight response. And that's where your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. Your eyes are going to dilate, as we're going to go over when we get into sensation and perception. Your eyes will dilate to let in more light so that you can navigate your environment, assuming that it's lit. Your body's going to inhibit salivation and digestion. That's all to cut down the calories you're processing, because you might need those calories because you're about to have to run for a long time. Your heart rate's going to increase to pump blood to your muscles, again, whether you're going to fight or run. And you're basically getting ready to exert a lot of physical activity. Your sympathetic nervous system is sympathetic to the fact that you're in this really terrible situation and you're about to have to do something drastic. So your body's preparing for it. But again, it's not something that you have to consciously decide to do. You do it automatically or autonomically. Now, one way that this can impact you is kind of in just normal stressors in life. You're probably not going to encounter a bear in your street very often. But the interesting thing is certain stressors, like presenting to a class or public speaking, going on a date or on an interview, those stressors simulate on a smaller scale this fight or flight response. So if you think about, you get dry mouth when you're presenting or you're interviewing, you're inhibiting salivation. Your body is going into this fight or flight response because it can't delineate, your autonomic nervous system can't delineate the stress you feel in an interview from the stress you feel when you run across a bear in the middle of the street. It sounds crazy, but it's true. Moving on to the central nervous system, again this is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to move on to the brain. Now your brain is basically, it's kind of this folded in mass of tissue. Your brain, by the way, the consistency of it is kind of soft. It stays in place because of some specific tissues and membranes, and it's crammed inside your skull. But it's really not a very hard structure. When we think of the hard brains, if you've ever seen a sheep's brain or something, it's that texture and it's that consistency because it's been preserved in chemicals. But really it's a fairly soft tissue. It kind of sloshes around inside your brain in a way, or inside your skull, in a way. And it has two hemispheres. So they are fairly symmetric in shape, but they are not symmetric completely in terms of function, as we're going to go over. So this idea of lateralization comes in play. And it's the idea, and not even the idea, it's the reality that basically the left hemisphere of your brain controls the right side of your body and picks up on sensory information from the right side of your body. So you're kind of cross-wired in a way, which is very interesting. And there are things to do with vision that this impacts later on. So you have these two hemispheres of the brain, and then your hemispheres of the brain are really connected primarily by this very dense tissue, and it's actually just a bundle of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of axons. And that dense axon tissue is called the corpus callosum, which is right here, and this is a real picture of the corpus callosum in a brain. So that's the connecting tissue between the hemispheres. If you sever that, which can happen, and we'll go over that when we get into psychological disorders, some very interesting things happen in terms of your perception and your cognitive processing. It's not that you die. You don't die if you sever the corpus callosum, but the things that are happening on the left side of your brain can't communicate to the right side of your brain. And so specialized function, for instance language, that happens primarily on the left hemisphere, can't be processed on the right side of the brain. And so some interesting things happen. Again, you live through this. There's some quirks that can happen with your behavior. Now, if we look at the outside of the brain and then kind of zoom in, you've got several different structures. You've got the forebrain, which is this large portion here, the midbrain, which we'll touch on a little bit, and the hindbrain back here. So the hindbrain is kind of at the base of where your head meets your neck. If you want to reach back and kind of touch that, that's the hindbrain. And if you want to think about in terms of evolutionary history, how this worked is the old part of your brain in an evolutionary sense is really your hindbrain. And then it progresses and you get this really large forebrain up here. So one way that you can simplify this is the very human, uniquely human if you want to think of it, behaviors, cognitions, those are processed primarily by your forebrain, and specifically up here in your prefrontal cortex, right above your eyes. All of the things that are sometimes lovingly referred to as your lizard brain or your reptilian brain, I don't really like those terms, but essentially these evolutionarily old systems, that's your hindbrain back here. And these are kind of automatic gut reaction responses, whereas the forebrain and the prefrontal cortex up here above your eyes, that's more executive functioning, planning, thinking, decision-making, processing, all that stuff. Okay, so again, the forebrain, largest part of the brain, contains the cerebral cortex. That's kind of the outer covering of the brain, higher level processing. The thalamus, the hypothalamus, and some pituitary gland, other gland-based systems, limbic system. A lot of this we're not going to cover as much. It has more to do with emotion and emotion regulation. Now, in terms of the cerebral cortex, this is really where we get into the meat of the brain and what it does. The easiest way to think about the different functions of your brain is to focus on the cerebral cortex. And you can divide the cerebral cortex into four main parts. You've got the frontal lobe, which is literally just, if you put your hand kind of at the crest of where your forehead goes to the top of your head, that's your frontal lobe. On very top of your head, that's your parietal lobe. And remember, this goes across both hemispheres, left and right of your brain, so both sides. You've got the temporal lobe, which is basically take each hand and put them kind of over your ears. That's sort of where your temporal lobes are. And the occipital lobe is kind of on the back of your head. So directly the back of your head, not really where your neck meets the back of your head, slightly up from that. And each one of these areas has slightly different functions. Now, of course, it's not color-coded like this in real life, but each of these regions can be identified specifically because they focus on different things. Different information, different behaviors are processed in these different regions of your brain. So if we focus on the frontal lobe, a few of the things that are really important that happen here. We mentioned already the prefrontal cortex, which is more executive functioning, but another thing that happens at the very back of the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. So your ability to move your fingers and toes and have all this fine dexterity with everything, that is because of the primary motor cortex, which is on the back of the frontal lobe. The prefrontal cortex, again, that's right above your eyes. You're thinking higher level cognitive functioning, all the stuff that you really need to do to be a good college student happens right there. Broca's area, which is kind of to the left, but frontal lobe, so sort of take your left ear and then kind of up and toward your eyes a little bit from there. That's an area called Broca's area. It's got to do with motor functioning, but specifically for language. And we'll talk more about that here in other sections, and I'll probably put a video up to show you what happens when you have damage to Broca's area. Now, one of the things that's interesting historically is we have all these case studies about what happens when people have damage to these specific regions of the brain. And a very famous, sometimes overstated case for how we know what happens on the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex is this guy named Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage worked on a railroad. He was a very high-functioning person. I believe he's a foreman, essentially, of this railroad, so someone who had good decision-making and planning skills. And he was tamping this rod down, and an explosion happened, and it sends this rod directly through his skull. And this is an illustration of it over here in part B. This is actually Phineas Gage on the left. You can see that it damaged his eye and he couldn't see out of it anymore. But this rod goes right through the top of his head. Now, miraculously, he lives for a little while. But what happens is his prefrontal cortex right here above his left eye is severely damaged, basically removed entirely. And because of that, we get an illustration of what happens when you damage someone's frontal cortex. And what happened is that his decision-making was severely impaired. Not in the way that you think, well, he just couldn't do it anymore. It dramatically changed his personality. He became more erratic, less thoughtful, a little more aggressive and angry. And we know that now that's because it really destroyed his ability to do those things, because that brain tissue was literally not there anymore. Now, if we focus back to the temporal lobe, we've got this area called Wernicke's area. Wernicke was a German scientist who discovered this specific area, just like Broca was, I believe, a French scientist who discovered this area. And we're talking about Wernicke because it has to do with auditory processing. And auditory processing is one of the main things that happens on the temporal lobe on each side. Now, specifically on the left side, and this is for most people, the left side is where language processing occurs. So we already talked about Broca's area. Now we'll talk about Wernicke's area. Broca's area has to do with language production, so literally moving your mouth, your lips, your tongue to produce specific sounds. It's a motor function which happens along the primary motor cortex right here at the back of the frontal lobe. Wernicke's area doesn't have to do with production, it has to do with processing. So with Wernicke's area, you can produce, if you have damage to Wernicke's area, you can produce the sounds. That's not the issue. You have your primary motor cortex. What you don't get is the ability to understand what you're producing, and it's a little bit higher level cognitive functioning. So again, I'll put a video up of someone who has something called Wernicke's aphasia, which is basically just damage to Wernicke's area. What you get with people who have Wernicke's aphasia is word salad. So there is no difficulty in speaking like you might get with Broca's aphasia, but instead what you have is very fluent nonsense speech. They might say, the green cat walked through the door, what? I don't know. Say when? And you just keep saying stuff and it's very fluent, but it doesn't make any sense. And it's kind of fascinating. Now, if you have damage to both areas, like if you got hit really hard on the side of your left side of your head, you might have global aphasia, which basically means you can't really speak well and you can't understand what other people are saying, including yourself. On the back of your head, is the occipital lobe. Now, the occipital lobe is primarily for processing of visual information. And it's kind of interesting. So we'll get into this in sensation and perception, but your eyes are right here below your frontal lobe. And you have the optic nerve, which passes and then crosses the corpus callosum and then goes back to your occipital lobe. And then the information is processed at higher and higher levels all the way up to the front. But the first stage of processing really happens at the occipital lobe. Now, one way that you might encounter this in your life is if you ever got hit in the back of the head or fall down and you kind of black out for a second or see stars, for instance. That's because literally this part of your brain is kind of bouncing up against the inside of your skull, and it's being stimulated, or it's being damaged or temporarily atrophied or something, where you're getting a loss of information. So it's basically cortical blindness. Your eyes are working just fine, but your brain doesn't have a way to process it, so you kind of can't see or see things that aren't there for a moment. Now, in terms of the limbic system, this is more in the middle part. It's technically still the forebrain, but we're kind of zooming into the middle a little bit more. This has some very interesting functions. You know, the amygdala has a lot to do with emotional processing. So if you see something that's terrifying, you might have a very primal, immediate reaction to that. The same thing a little bit with the hypothalamus. It's more sort of autonomic, immediate, automatic functioning. One of the things that's interesting about the hippocampus, and again, all these are just different regions of your brain specialized in things, but the hippocampus has a lot to do with learning and memory. And I will share a video of someone who has damage to the hippocampus as well. In that case, the hippocampus, you know, if it's destroyed, you basically lose the ability to develop new memories in particular. Old memories, so memories that were longer standing, that are part of what's called long-term memory, they're spread around the brain in different regions over time. But the creation of new memories kind of starts here in that hippocampus, this sort of weird curved structure right here. If this is damaged, you just can't form new memories. It's like the